My bald head's gonna be in there all the time. It's there.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to this final event of this international conference. What we're going to witness now will probably be an excellent debate featuring an outstanding debater.
You leave the room immediately.
Who will be debating the motion this House believes that in schools, testing is the enemy of learning. And now, without further ado, I call upon Sam Nelson to present the government's case.
Thank you, Mr. Chair Creature. At this point, I'd like to support the concept that this House believes that in schools, testing is the enemy of learning, and there are several reasons why this is true, but first of all, I need to define some key terms so there is no misunderstanding, intentional or accidental, among any of the debaters about exactly what the first government stands for. First of all, schools, and I know not all of you have been to such an institution, but it is a registered educational site of learning conducted by teachers. Testing is any standardized way of evaluating, and we all know what a test is. And finally, enemy. Enemy is a foe or friend bent on evil or malicious conduct. Now, to the debate. The model that we will represent, that we will put forth and advocate in this debate is that of the free market system. You'll notice that when you go to apply for a job, that most employers do not give you a test. They ask you some questions, they find out what you've done, they see what you can do, but it would be foolish if every employer simply gave you a test and then put you in the job.
Hold on one second.
Certainly.
You're familiar, of course, big consulting firms do extensive standardized tests.
Yes.
All of
And that is why they are flawed. Yes. Think of a consulting firm that has actually lived up to the promise that they give before they are hired. Yeah. You rarely find one. In fact, consulting is just another way of saying confident scam in many ways. And you future consultants know what I'm talking about. Yeah. Now, let me get to, now that I've presented our model of the free market system, and that we'll let employers figure it out and treat each individual as an individual as opposed to a number. My first argument is that testing is educationally and pedagogically flawed. It is not good education. Education is when you promote intellectual curiosity. I challenge anyone in this room to think of the last test that encouraged intellectual curiosity. When you study for a test, you are studying to get a score, not to get knowledge. And we know this is to be true, and I challenge anyone, and especially our opponents on this issue, to show me a case study. Bring it.
What about IQ tests then?
And oh good, I hope you've been studying well for your IQ test. Because the issue is to promote whatever your IQ is, high or low. What I'm advocating here is that you promote intellectual curiosity. It is not where you start. It is where you end. Now on to my next point. Also, people, when they train for a test, it is superficial. It is not long-term lasting knowledge or insight. Instead, it is, what do I need to do to get the score? My third argument is the tests are often not accurate. In the United States, we have something called the Scholastic Aptitude Test, the SAT, right? They're not accurate at all. The people that get good SAT scores don't necessarily do the best in college or later in life. If it was that simple, well, yes.
So basically you're telling us that your country doesn't know how to put together a decent standardized test.
Yes, and my argument is no country does, because the flaw is not with the country in your jingoistic, nationalistic Slovenian way. The flaw is with the vehicle that we use to measure. Now keep your keep it to yourself, because I move on to my next argument. They are not fair. Fairness is the combination of equality and justice, and these tests are often biased. I think of the case of the Mexican school child in the American school system when it's asked a question dealing with mathematics that tells them about loaves of bread. They're not used to loaves of bread, they're used to tortillas. There is a unique advantage to the person that is mainstream in these sort of situations. This is ignored and marginalized. My next argument is that it embraces the philosophy of measurement, that size is what matters. More is, we need more, we need more, we need more. That bigger is better. We know that size doesn't matter. At least that's what Sam Greenland tells me. Sam, your question.
Tell you about your own benefit, Sam. But my question, sir, is this. If you oppose assessment, how do you propose for teachers to be able to adequately assess the results of their work?
I know you study education, and let me enlighten you now, because this is the most important thing you need to learn. That teachers do not need to worry about whether or not their students are learning. They need to learn whether or not they are doing a good job. To evaluate the value of the teacher by the score of the students is a flawed assumption. A teacher should evaluate their effectiveness by the relationship that they have with students. I know there's a lot of teachers in this audience. You can look into the eyes of students and figure out whether the lights are on or off. You don't have to look at a score. Is that a minute left?
Yes.
Okay, now let me conclude. Okay, I'm going to conclude with one final argument. There is something called testing apprehension. That is when anxiety is caused because the student is worried about how they'll do on the test. That should never occur in a learning environment. People like to learn. Little kids, when you meet them, they like to learn. They want to learn. They're curious. It is our educational system that beats that love of learning out of them. And the number one weapon that beats that love of learning in is called the test. I challenge them at this point to tell me why that test isn't a weapon, why it is somehow nurturing, why it is somehow helpful, why it is the basis of our educational system. They will never answer this question. This house believes testing is the enemy.
I now invite Candace Williams to open the case for the opposition.
It's funny because my mother always told me that ignorance is the #1 enemy of learning, and what this side is proposing is just ignorance on a massive scale, and that is my team line today. They throw out terms like free market and nurturing and looking into students' eyes and knowing in your soul that you are doing a good job. But what I will show you here today is that testing and evaluation are sound practices proven in the literature, and yes, I am a student of Kate Schuster. So to start, I'm going to talk about my own personal history about fairness. In America, Black people, people who are poor, and a lot of others were oppressed in our society. And for a long time, people were ignorant of that oppression until we had testing that showed, hey look, how come most Black children are not learning as much as white children? How come most children who are poor aren't getting high scores? It's because we're not giving them access to education. But without testing, comparing different groups of different regions, comparing groups of different socioeconomic statuses, we wouldn't be able to know that. And now, senators and congressmen and average people are asking, how can we give poor students, how can we give Black students, how can we give oppressed students more access to good education in our system? Without testing, that wouldn't have happened, and that's true in other countries as well. I'll take your point.
Do you give any credit to, for example, individuals like Martin Luther King?
Yes,
and Civil Rights Movement in 1964?
Of course.
Were they advocating tests?
All right, no. Here's what they were advocating. They were advocating their students being given access to the best education possible. But how can we tell how well students are doing without tests? You're just saying that teachers should just look every student in the eye and see how much math they know, how much science they know. Teachers don't have ESP, they don't have some sort of telekinetic path into students' souls. We hear parents complaining about how they don't know what their students are thinking. I don't understand how that is sound practice. And my next argument is about how testing, of course testing shouldn't be by itself. Like, we shouldn't have a system where students take tests all day long and that's all they do. No, of course not, and that's not the status quo. What happens is that testing is a very small part of your school day. You go in and you learn from a teacher, and then sometimes they'll say, I wonder how well Candace is doing in math. They may give you a math standardized test, or they might have you do some sort of in-class exercise. But the whole thing is that we need a way to evaluate how students are doing over time and between students, and also holistically. So I'll take your point.
Ma'am, do you not just accept that essentially what tests prove is how good pupils are at doing tests? You say that it doesn't take a very long time, but the whole education system, we're saying all the time that people spend in schools is wasted because it's all going to making them good at tests, which only shows if they're good at tests.
Okay. You were talking about flawed tests. Now, there are good tests and there are bad tests. Not all tests just measure how well students are at taking tests. For example, he gives the example about how in America, we asked a lot of Mexicans to take tests, and we asked them to count loaves of bread, and that's all of the testing that they're doing. No, we have many different tests for different types of people. If you have a learning disability, in California, we don't make you take the same test as students who don't. If you're from a different community, we have you take a different test that is actually normed with students from your same background. So there are different types of tests and evaluations for different times. And now I'm going to go on to their points, and I'm just going to go through and say why I think they're just totally wrong. So they say, their first major point is that in the free market, firms don't use tests. Firms never use tests to hire people. That's just completely false. If you want to work for Boeing and build airplanes that are very complicated with like engineering, they might make you sit down and take a test to make sure that you can do basic calculus. The industries use tests all the time. Furthermore, there are different types of tests that they use. Interviews are actually a type of test where you're assessing what a person knows. So that point just falls. Also, what is the free market based on? It's based on information. Information is the currency of the free market. In order to make choices about what you buy, who you hire, you have to know what is in those products and what those people know. So if you want to go for the free market, you want to go for a system where you have testing to give people information about how to act. They say that testing is superficial, and we agree. We agree that in the United States and in other countries, there are many superficial tests. But let's not throw away the whole testing paradigm. Let's improve it. Let's look at what has been done in the research that says that here are the good tests and here are the bad tests, and let's have a system that actually uses testing in moderation. Let's not throw it all away and have a la-la land where teachers come up to you and stare in your eyes and give you an A if they like your smile. No, that's completely wrong. They also said students should be there for the love of learning, and all students love to learn. And if any of you have ever taught a classroom of students, you know that not all students like to learn. That whole argument is based on this premise that's just completely false. What you want to do is you want to have a system where students are exposed to the real world. And in the real world, they're going to have to do things that they may not like. And also in the real world, people test you. People test me all the time. All of my friends test me. They're like, Candace, do this really hard task that you don't want to do. All of my teachers test me. You live in a world with constant challenges. Therefore, we have to challenge students in the classroom, possibly make them do things that they don't want to do, but also we can change our tests and make them better, and make them a true measure of what students actually know. So, all right.
So you seem to be agreeing with Friedrich Nietzsche that that does not kill you, only makes you stronger. Maybe we should hold them underwater as well. You want to challenge, right? You want to make it miserable.
No, I want
to be harmful.
I like Nietzsche, by the way, but I want sound educational practices. I don't want to hold students underwater because then they'd be dead and they wouldn't be learning anything. I want to create a world where I know what my students know and where people of different groups have access to the same level of education. And in order to do that, you need some form of assessment. And as I've shown you in history, in many countries, for example, in Korea, they also found that people who were of Japanese descent didn't have as high scores as people who were Korean. And they do that because of testing, and they were able to change their system. So without, this team got up here and said, let's just abolish and ban all testing bad. I say, sometimes testing bad, but what you need to do is have testing in moderation. Use it in a framework that actually promotes holistic learning. That's what they're saying. And this is true with the real world if you look at jobs and hiring. It's true with the free market. And it's also true with common sense. So as my mom said, ignorance is the true foe of learning, and if you want a system that actually works, you're going to go with my side. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for her excellent speech, and I now invite Alex Just to continue the case for the government.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen. Now we've heard what Americans think. Obviously a little bit skewed, so I'm going to bring some real perspective, some British, proper establishment views. I go to Oxford University, a centre of learning and knowledge since the 13th century, where incidentally we didn't have tests until about 50 years ago. You used to just be able to go to Oxford, drink tea, maybe go to some debates in the Union after it was built, train racehorses, just do whatever you wanted really, and then after 3 years you were a well-rounded gentleman and you could go and get a job or be an MP. And I wish that that was still the system, because then I wouldn't have finals, I wouldn't have to do any work, but more importantly, what I think the opposition have failed to realise in the fact that they've tried to set this debate up as one in which they're going to reform testing and make testing better, because they think that somehow they can make it good, is they've missed the whole crux of Sam's argument, which is that testing sucks, full stop. It's just a bad thing. And we don't think you can do anything to remove the fact that testing is by its nature a process that tests people. And it looks for specific things and asks students on a specific date and time to turn up and turn in knowledge in a compartmentalised way that's checked off against various criteria which we don't think are very objective and we don't think are good for the modern economy. No thank you. So what I'm going to do in my speech is look at a little bit more of the wider impact that we think our free market system, where we abolish testing and we just get people, no thanks, to actually think about how holistically we develop individuals. And I'm going to be looking at how, under the status quo, governments manipulate tests to make the education system not as good as it could be, because they constantly focus on trying to make schools good on the basis of testing, and how this actually leads to a ghettoization of many school areas. And that can have an impact on minorities, can also have an impact on people who don't have enough money to move to areas where the good schools are. And we think that that's wrong. And I'm also going to look at about the motivation that we think this has in terms of the classroom dynamic for pupils and also for teachers. But before I do any of that, I want to have a look at what Candace said in her speech, because her first main argument was essentially that we have to have tests, otherwise all minority groups will be oppressed, we'll have colonialism again, Oxford will, people will leave Oxford and just go and start conquering the world, like in the good old days of empire, and that will be how things will happen. But we must empower these people. Whereas actually, thank you, what Sam and I would say is that the people who are disadvantaged most from testing at the moment are minority groups, are people who can't afford, for example, to pay for the extra SAT practice papers, to go to the hot housing, the institutions, I'll take you in a second, Sam, where they're given all the opportunities because they come from certain socioeconomic groups where they have this background and tradition of constantly testing people. And that's why it's not fair. That's why minorities aren't able to get ahead, because they just can't take the test because they don't have the money to pay for the extra training. Go on, Sam.
So if you support a free market model into which it is inherent that efficient allocation of resources requires some form of evaluation, a about the efficiency of that allocation. How do you not evaluate?
We think it's perfectly clear. We think it's perfectly possible to evaluate without testing. We think that people can go to interviews, that you can turn up for a job, and people can ask you general questions about whether or not you think it's a good idea. I mean, Candace said in her speech, if you can do basic calculus, you can build an aeroplane. Well, that's not true. Sam can barely hold a drink in his hand through the course of a day, for various reasons, mostly involving what he drinks. But he can do calculus. So would you want Sam to go and build Boeing aeroplanes? No, of course not. Whereas what they're trying to say is that just because he ticks the box, because he can work out some equation, that means he's necessarily going to be good. That's just nonsense. It's not at all the way that we think things should work. She also then kind of misrepresented Sam's point about looking into students' souls. Sam has very good, healthy professional relationships with all his students. 2 of them are here, they've had a lovely time, they're lovely, well-rounded individuals who have given excellent presentations. And I think they should be applauded, because Sam doesn't mark their papers. Sam is not interested in what Cornell want him to do. He's bucking the trend. He's trying to fight against the system. And I think that we should accept that Sam is a kind of revolutionary figure. I think the fact today that we're making an effort to change things is not being acknowledged by the proposition. And then finally, they kind of gave a bit of rebuttal about why the information was needed for the free market. That argument is fine if the information is good, but we say that the information is bad because all it tells you is whether or not the people can do the test. So actually, on our model of wanting to have efficient allocation of resources, we think that there are better ways for people to do that. So let's have a look now at what I want to bring to the debate, which is how we think testing impacts on the wider education system. Firstly, we think that governments, because they have very short-term objectives, want to make people pass tests so that they can say in the newspaper, we have raised the level of people who can do math or who can speak Slovene from this number to this number. And that just means that they can have a headline and they can show that things are getting better. What it doesn't mean is that they actually improve the whole education system. So they have these league tables saying this is the best school in Slovenia. We were told this is the best university in Slovenia, best university in Ljubljana. I think it's the only university in Ljubljana. But that's the point. You just put things in a list and you say Cornell, number 13, Oxford, number 2, whatever, and sometimes Cambridge is above it, which is ridiculous. Everybody knows, and Sam's not going to argue because he has a degree from Oxford. All you do is try and put lists with people. And when you have lists, it means that people will move, if they have money, into the areas where those good schools are. And the good schools are formed on the basis of what the test results are. That leads to ghettoization of particular communities. So you find people moving out of areas where they want to go and find these schools where they think the testing is very good, and that sucks the resources and sucks everything out. If we had no testing, no thanks, we wouldn't have the opportunity for people to do that, because they'd all be going to schools which we think would be much better because of the next argument I'm going to make, which is about why we think it's generally in the interest of teachers and pupils. We think that learning for the sake of learning is much more effective and much more empowering than learning for the sake of being able to tick boxes, which the government or some other testing authority has decided to make up. We think, furthermore, that in an environment where you're testing, you inherently have competition against other people in your class. You're not encouraged to cooperate. You're not encouraged, because very often there are only certain numbers of people who can be in the first percentile, or you're competing for grades, and that always means that you don't have an attitude of cooperation, like we had here. If Tuna had ranked all of the papers in this conference and said, I have a test, and Bayana, she gave the top paper, big surprise. That would be slightly unfair to Sam, who probably would have given one of the less good papers. And Sam might not come back next year, or in 2010, because he'd feel like he was a loser, like he'd failed. And that's what testing does. It makes losers out of people. It tends to tell people, you failed. And we don't want that to happen. We want everyone to come to school thinking that they're learning, they're in a positive environment, and when they leave, they can go and show their employer at the interview stage that they have the right skills. We think if you give people access to this kind of empowering education, if you change the status quo, if we make learning more in-depth, so it's not just about specifically ticking boxes, if we go back to the system of Oxford in the 1880s, in the era of Gladstone, I thoroughly believe that the world would be a much, much better place. England would probably rule most of the planet, but we don't have to have that anymore. We can have everyone with their own country and a 19th century outlook. And I think, for the reasons that the revolutionary team have given, you must support our revolution. Join the struggle. Viva le anti-testing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for a fine speech. And now I invite Manolis, Polychronides, to continue the case for the output.
Thank you, Mrs. Speaker. Now, what did the guy with the Palestinian fluffy thing around his neck told us? Viva la revolution. Yes. So let's go back to Oxford, that supposedly he came from. A system of education that was for how many people in this room? Maybe half? You know, how many, if you are not like rich, coming from a very rich family and having a lot of money, or maybe privileged as well, how many of you will be actually educated? Because the consequences of their plan is having, and this is the consequence of free market, without having intervention by a responsible authority, is to have, you know, people who have privilege just excel. This is not what we stand for. What we stand for is what my partner said, that the basic reason against learning is ignorance. And we want to fight ignorance, because if we cannot measure somehow how much we know, we cannot find out whether minorities are oppressed. And this is a point that was completely lost by my opponents. No, sit down, please, both of you. So, what is the point here? They're advocating nepotism, because Oxford, this is exactly what it was. They advocate a free market economy, where those that are in power will continue being in power. So, okay, but first of all, let's just see the consequences of their plan. Because in order to actually look at the eyes of every single of your students, sir, probably have to be cross-eyed. It's impossible to actually look in the eyes of every single student. And how much time do you actually need, please both of you sit down, to actually look in the eyes of every person? I mean, just imagine, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, yes please, sir.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, so do you understand that our argument is that not that we do some sort of ESP, but when I said I was using the metaphor that when you look in your eyes, actually I was advocating a relationship between student and teacher other than one on paper based on numbers.
Yeah. Fair enough. I'm all about relations, though some relations are not very good. I'm not really sure about that. We can discuss about it. But in any case, what I'm saying, this is not, it's a completely inefficient way, and ineffective as a result, way of teaching many people. If you want to teach people, you have to know how well they're doing. And in order to know how well you're doing, you need to have a tool. Because this is what a test is. It's a tool. It's a tool that actually makes us understand where are the gaps.
Sir.
It helps you as a student to know how well you're doing. You can measure up with other students at the same time. You can have results for a community, for a country. Because it's only through cross-country testing that allowed people, maybe in Slovenia, to know that, you know, there's something wrong in what we're doing. Maybe we should change what we're doing. And this wouldn't have happened without international standardized tests like PISA. Go ahead, sir.
Why have both of the first two opposition speakers ignored the fact that our indictment is of standardized testing in schools, not all evaluation?
Okay, probably you just knifed the opening government, sir, because what you just did. Yes, but I don't see how else can you do it, maybe just with the relationship of the eyes. Anyway, sir, I'm sorry, but you just blew it. In any case, what the last speaker was telling us was, you know, test us. Well, let's go back generally to what she said in the beginning. She said that, you know, we said that only through calculus you can build Boeing. This is nothing we have said This is nothing we have said before. And you know, as the only real ESL speaker in this debate, I have to say that I would probably feel, you know, discouraged to participate in something that hasn't evaluated me in order to improve. Because that's the whole idea. It's only through testing that I can actually know how well I'm doing. No, thank you, sir. And therefore, improve myself. And this is the main thing. If we want to battle ignorance, if we want to battle the problems, we have to know where we're standing. And in order to know where we're standing, we need a tool. And yes, there is some bad testing. I completely agree with that. But this is what my partner has said. There are good tests and bad tests. Okay. We don't want bad testing. We want good testing, obviously. Yes.
Do you agree that when pupils fail exams, they then decide that they're branded as a loser and it's very difficult to persuade them to be positive about their learning experience? By not having testing, you make everybody take part in a general learning experience that's holistic, and you don't have people branded failures, and that's why they become disillusioned and leave the education system and become failed people who kill other people.
Well,
that's all in your hands.
Alex, you're not doing justice to your surname. You're not being just. You're not being fair to what we're saying. Because you need to know where you are at. And sometimes you need to face failure. Because life is full of failures. You need to prepare kids for that. You need to prepare that they're going to be tested by even stairs. Stairs can be very testing at the same time, especially in the workplace. But you need to have some standardized way. No, thank you, sir. You had plenty of chances. So, yeah, I got it.
So under your understanding and your point about English as a second language, so you don't really understand right now whether or not you're communicating to our audience until you get the test score back.
Yes. So, what's the whole point? Debating is an activity that requires evaluation. And your students that you mentioned, when your partner mentioned before, came here because of debating, because they were evaluated, because they tested themselves. And maybe you can claim that debating is not a standardized test, even though through the speech of the gentleman beforehand, through the adjudication and accreditation thing, we might need some standardized tests as well. What we're trying to say as the opposition, you cannot just scrap away standardized tests. Yes, there have been flaws, there are problems, but we can correct them. We can change them in order to take justice for minorities, for disadvantaged groups. The weakness of which we wouldn't have found out if we didn't have standardized testing. This is the balance that we need to find. Fairness and effectiveness. And the only way to combine both of them is through standardized testing. Only through standardized testing we can actually make sure that everyone gets a fair chance. And you know what, sir? If you fail a test, it's okay. There are more tests anyway. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now invite Tuna to give this debate a new dimension.
Ladies and gentlemen, life should be the test, and education should be the preparation for that test. And when our side of the house sees that standardized testing in schools, I want to repeat that because they seem to have missed that. Standardized testing in schools works against the mission of education, then I think you'll realize that the government will carry the day in today's debate. We do, as a matter of fact, want to present some new issues for your consideration, to refocus the debate a little bit, and that's because the first government has done an excellent job of outlining some important issues, and we have some more. Then after that, I'd like to go back and, in a small amount of time, refute the arguments that the opposition has launched. Please consider these two arguments that we will offer for your consideration. First, that standardized testing is irrelevant to student needs in the 21st century. And our second major issue will be that standardized testing is problematic in a multicultural world. First, let's talk about how the nature of knowledge has changed. I'm sure we all know about the fallacy of tradition. Well, what we've used before, we should continue to use it. Why, we've had slavery for centuries. Why, we've kept women in servitude for a long time, and so we should keep it? No, we argue that things have changed. When things change, you need to change the way you deal with the world. And we feel that in the future, that in education, especially the future, is the most important. Now, how has the nature of knowledge changed in the 21st century? Previously, we had a small amount of knowledge. Most highly intellectual people could master most of the knowledge that existed. You could become a Renaissance person, and you could deal with the data, and that was fine. Why? Because the pace of change was slow. because there was the growth of knowledge was slow, and so you could learn something and it would serve your entire life. That's not the way it works anymore. You may change your jobs several times during your life. In fact, during your life, the nature of our understanding of the universe and the nature of our understanding of the world will change appreciably, and you need to be taught to deal with change. We don't think that standardized testing does that. Standardized testing tests bits of discrete data. Pick A, B, or C. It doesn't measure critical thinking. It doesn't measure creative thinking. It doesn't understand how you synthesize ideas. It fails in all of those. And why does it fail? For another reason, because the teachers teach to the test. Ask the teachers who presented the paper this morning, proving that the teachers teach to the Matura exam here in Slovenia instead of teaching the kind of information that people need. We must have these skills. The skills of critical thinking, information synthesis, creativity, and cooperation that are never rewarded by standardized testing. Planet Earth faces huge problems. Climate change, the income gap, nuclear weapons, religious and ethnic conflicts. We need new ways of thinking, and you don't get it with their side. Man.
In order for students to solve these problems, not only do they have to know critical thinking skills, but they also have to know content. They cannot change global warming without knowing the definition of global warming, how global warming is occurring, so you need a system that actually assesses their knowledge.
Yes, in a world of without standardized testing, we're not going to make content irrelevant. But what happens now is that critical thinking, information synthesis, and these other things is made irrelevant by standardized testing. That's how you get into university. That's how you get your ticket to success. And so that's what they're taught. Only content. We think we need both. My second argument is that standardized testing is problematic in a multicultural world. The government focus is on standardized testing. In schools, as I've mentioned, standardized tests are created and administered to a non-standardized population. Of course there are people in the population who don't fit into the standardized test. In a multicultural world, individuality is absolutely essential. We must have these different perspectives. We cannot be ignoring people because they don't fit into the standardized categories. In the old education system, we try to force the student into the standardized mold. Now we need to recognize difference. We need non-standardized forms of evaluation, which is what this side of the house represents and advocates, instead of trying to make everyone know one thing. Ms. Kerr.
So if we could come up with a standardized test that could assess your critical thinking after you've been taught how to do it, would you support it?
No, because it wouldn't recognize the inherent difference of the individuals. Everybody's different class, different ethnic group, different experience. We need different ways of evaluation, and that's what you're going to get when you go with this side of the house. Now I think most of now let's turn to their arguments. Most of them fall aside when you realize that Sam used the S word, standardized testing. We'll be administering a cooperative, non-standardized listing exercise for the opposition later. But if my old ears can get it, I'm sure you did as well. And if that's true, then we're not doing away with all forms of evaluation and replacing it with looking them deep in the eyes. We're not George Bush sizing up Vladimir Putin. This is ridiculous. Standardized tests are what we're against. The opposition confuses that. And we have to have some kind of standard arguments. And what does Manolis tell us? Well, they have flaws, they have difficulties, they have problems. We're going to fix them. Right? That doesn't answer our argument. What kind of promise is that? We don't need to test minorities. We don't need tests to know that minorities are victimized in our society. We don't need tests to know that Roma children are probably not receiving the education we need. And the education that they're forced to get when teachers teach to the test doesn't allow them to develop their potential to solve the problems I'm talking about. What problems are those? The problems of life. Life should be the test. Let life be the test. Education should be the preparation. Do away with standardized testing, which pollutes the curriculum. And if you do that, then you will agree that you should propose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tuna, for an excellent speech. And I now invite Sam Greenland.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be here. For those of you watching this debate on the internet for the second or third time, hello again. What I'm going to be doing in this speech is several things. Firstly, I'd like to recognise that what our first opposition team has shown me is how standardised testing leads to better policies in education. The extension that the closing opposition team is going to bring to you is how actually standardised testing allows for better policy, not just in the areas of education, but in broader society as a whole. I'll be coming on to that in just a moment. Before that, I need to look at a couple of key things. Like one of those is going to be some of the points that have just come out from the closing team on government, and the other is going to be the case shift that has occurred during this debate. It's always fun when you have two different debates, one from the opening half and one from the closing half, and in classic style, I'm going to try and deal with both. Because what Sam said was, quote, testing sucks. He didn't say only current definitions of SATs suck. He said testing sucks. And so for Tuna to come up and maintain that evaluation is good as long as it's not standardised is a definitive shift. And it's always nice to try and carve out the opening opposition team of the debate by saying you should have been opposing something else, therefore inherently you're wrong. But it's not really cricket. Let's have a look, therefore, at what we got from the opening team. Because they said standardised means of assessment are bad, testing is bad, testing sucks, Tuna. And that even my ears from far over there were able to pick up. And it's a good thing that Sam teaches and doesn't, build a mission critical system. Because what he essentially told us is he asked us to answer the question, why does testing help? And that's something I'm going to come on to in just a moment. But on top of that, he said, you need a good job. To have a good job, you need to have good relationships, no thanks, Tuna, with your students. And we contend on this side of the house that if you are doing your job properly as a teacher, you need to know how well your students are receiving the information that you give them and how well they're developing the test. No, thank you. And we asked a very important question to you. Said, if it was possible to have a standardised test for critical thinking skills, would that be okay? And Gina says, no, every student is different, therefore every student deserves some kind of different test. No thanks. And what we say is that if you want to discern differences accurately, you need to have some form of standard of reference. If you want to know how to adapt and amend your teaching because students are different, you need to know how to do that in the first place by assessing the extent to which those students are different. And just before I take you, sir, also to point out that just to say that you need a good teacher-student relationship is not mutually exclusive with having tests.
My question is, what is the value of a number? How is that a point of reference if there is a flaw in the concept of testing?
Well, once again, if what you are trying to ask the opposition to defend is the concept that bad tests are good things, that's kind of unfortunate. If, on the other hand, what we're saying is what value is a number, we would contend that standardised testing, let's talk about standardised testing. But the purpose, that doesn't mean you win, it just means I'm being nice to you because you knife them. If you're going to say that what's the value in a number, we would say that standardised tests don't just give you a number. The purpose of standardised testing is not just to spit out a number. The purpose of standardised testing is to assess, on the basis of standards of reference which we in society require, and I'm going to come on to that in just a moment, how much more we need to do as educators to ensure that you, the students, receive the knowledge and experience which we believe is necessary for the great test that is life. No, thank you. Because what we're going to say on this side is that if you want to take a free market system, and again it was raised in the point of information, free market system which requires an efficient allocation of resources, that you need some means of assessing the extent to which those resources are being efficiently allocated, and more important, the way they need to be allocated in the future. And this notion that Alex came up with, which is a test tells you that you're a loser, well, we would again say that the flaw there lies not with the testing, but with the test. Because yes, it's true, if you have any form of education, if you have an utterly non-standardized, non-testing environment that tells you you're a loser, we'd also say that that is bad. Telling kids that they're losers is not a good thing.
Sir.
No, thank you. What we would contend though is that it is perfectly possible, and it is done in a number of countries, in a number of systems, to design tests which are standardized to the extent that they're administered across a curriculum, they're administered across a society, which assess a number of different skills.
Sir.
And then inherently, everybody is going to be better at some things and not as good at others. And what we need to do as a society, here's where we move to the extension of, is as a society we need to understand who has which skills, who has which areas of comparative advantage, so that we as a society can best, firstly, use that to societal advantage, but also adapt what we do to those individuals. And therefore, any kind of standardized testing which looks at where an individual skill area lies, which then allows us to adapt our processes to that areas of skill, is a valuable thing. No, thank you. Because we'd say that, for example, assessing whether a student is suited to going to a gymnasium and learning lots of Latin vocabulary,
Sir.
or alternatively, no thank you, would be better, would get greater fulfillment and has a greater skill area in other fields, is necessary. And that's very valuable for that student, and it's very valuable for society. And in order to do that, we need to have some form of broad standardized reference in order to assess which of our educational opportunities are most appropriate for that student. I'll take you, sir.
So you're saying standardized testing now makes possible the kind of tracking that determines where people's lives are going at age 13. How is that an advantage for you?
I don't think actually that's what I said at all. I think what I said, I think actually what I said is that a form of evaluation and a form of assessment that allows us at any given time to most appropriately adapt an educational system or educational resources to you as an individual is a highly valuable thing. And that in order to be able to do that, that has to be referenced against standards, because if you don't reference it against standards, then all you get is a number. We say, congratulations, you're a 37. What does a 37 mean? We have no idea, because there are no standards. So that kind of sucks. Instead, what we say is, no, we are referencing you against the standards. For example, these are the different skills which are going to be trained and developed in different educational environments. What we need is some form of assessment which determines which is the best opportunity for you next year. If we're to provide career counselling for individuals, for example, we need to be able to say whether you should be building aeroplanes or not. And thankfully, Sam is not. So, in essence, Madam Speaker, what you have from this side of the House in opposition to that is firstly, not a defence of what Tuna wanted us to say, is that he wants to say that bad tests are bad. Good, but not very big, not very clever. Instead, what we're going to say is that if society is to do its best by each and every individual, then we need to know about that individual, and we need to know about them based on references and standards that apply across society. And if the only way we can do that is through standardised testing, then that's a pretty good thing. That's why I'm proud to oppose.
And I now invite Mr. Omar Salahuddin bin Abdullah to wrap up the debate for this
Mr. Speaker, members of this august House, we came here today looking for answers, deeply philosophical answers. Why, for example, do all classrooms in this university have a sink and a mirror at the front? Is teaching such a dirty job? After tests have been administered, do people need reviving and regrooming in this particular country? We think on the government bench that this is an example of exactly what this debate is about today. Life should be the test. Learning prepares you for for life. That has been a consistent theme through the government bench today. In my speech, I'm going to be looking at a couple of things. I'm going to be looking first of all at the idea that we need tests to determine whether someone who wants to build an airplane can do calculus. I'm going to deal with that first of all. That came out of the opening up. I'm also going to look at this idea that tests are the thing we've been using all of this time, therefore we should go on using them because they've always been there and they're the best way. No. On this bench we have said they are not the best way. There are vastly superior alternatives. Teachers should be allowed access to those alternatives. The system should not depend upon standardized tests. And finally, I want to consider this last element which was introduced in well, it was termed an extension on this side of the House, that the purpose of standardized testing is not just to spit out a number. I want to deal with that latterly. Okay, so we need tests, first of all, to determine whether someone who wants to build an airplane can do calculus. I think this was a pretty small point right at the beginning, but basically I want to revisit it for a moment or two here. Perhaps, Madam Opposition Leader, perhaps people who want to build airplanes should learn how to build aeroplanes rather than passing your test, being given a spanner and a screwdriver and shown into a room full of bits of metal. Exactly. Yeah, here you go. There's a model kit plan. Go in and build me a Boeing. I think, quite to the contrary, that this is exactly just... No, take a seat. I haven't got into it yet. This is exactly why training processes are the most important part of the learning experience, not the testing part of the process. And this side is completely ignoring that, basically not with the program. Now, the second idea is that tests are tried and tested. Duh. And therefore, that tests are the most valid mechanism for assessing how much people know about testing. Because essentially that is what they're saying. This ignores the obvious effect upon the related processes of teaching and learning. Because why? Because what you are doing by imposing tests, terminal tests at the end of terms, terminal tests at the end of courses of education, what you're doing then is you are giving teachers a definitive set of goals which are specified by the test, not by the learning experience. That again is been something which has been consistent on this side. So teachers will teach to the test, won't you?
Well, sir, if the goal is to make sure that everybody who has a job building aeroplanes is fully qualified and has enough knowledge to do so, that's why we as a society have a standardised test at the end of your professional training to say, do you know enough before we let you loose on a Boeing?
Okay, so why in your system, as it exists at this moment in time, is it a fact of life that when you leave an education process in a country like Slovenia, in a country like Malaysia, in a country like the US, clutching your freshly warm degree in your hot, sweaty little hand, and you enter the profession, or whatever it is you want to, that you are immediately, in this day and age, sent for retraining. Why is that? We believe on this side that you are sent for retraining because the organizations, the corporations, and so on and so forth, do not trust the educational system, and it's because of your testing processes, not in spite of them. No, not at this time. Mr. Speaker, in schools in Asia, Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, and others, the test is the dominating factor in the nature and shape of teaching. In Korea, for example, parents spend more money on cramming schools and tuition schools than they do on the standard educational system. They pay thousands of US dollars to send their kids to schools so that they can be taught how to pass the exams. What does that make people? Answer, it makes people good passers of exams, but not necessarily good at anything else. And that was what our opening government said, and that is a line also that we've been consistent with. These cram schools are harsh taskmasters, teaching the students the stuff they need to know to pass the exam and ignoring any requirement to understand what is taught. Look, what students want to learn in this day and age, as Tuna was talking about, is not how to pass a test, but how to present ideas, how to be critical thinkers, how to present themselves in an interview and describe the things that they can do, how to practically apply the things that they've been taught. Excuse me. Okay. So at the end, we want good testing, not bad testing. No, Mr. Speaker, we don't want testing at all. But secondly, and something that they have yet to describe, and maybe it'll come out of their whip speech, who knows, because it certainly wasn't part of the matter, who decides how are tests standardized? Who decides what is a standardized test and who does not? The learner is basically abstracted from, deliberately, the process of education and learning. We believe that the test should go. We're very happy to propose.
Speech and to call upon Ms. Anna Kerr to conclude the debate.
Slovenia.
Now I have very, very pretty eyes. But my pretty eyes don't mean that I'm intrinsically going to know what my teachers are telling me whilst I'm sleeping in the back of my class. My pretty, pretty eyes, when my wonderful teacher looks into them, aren't actually going to mean that even though I've sat through my education, I've learnt what I had to learn to then go and develop my skills and be capable of building a Boeing that, well, I really wouldn't want to be sitting on that plane if you gave it to me to build. Because I don't, yeah, exactly. Wouldn't want to put anybody in this room on that plane right now. Yeah. But the problem is, well, okay, we might get rid of today's government, but that's only for 5 minutes. So, what the problem was trying to do, and when in the inconsistencies that we saw in today's government, when we finally got down to it, we saw that bad tests are bad. Ooh. Now, where was the big news that we were waiting for? There was none. Now, what we have to prove is that there is a possibility, that it is possible to design a test that assesses your skills. Now, of course it is. I mean, we kind of assess doctors. Do you have the skills to then go out and practice your profession? Do you have the skills to put together this wonderful Boeing 747? And I hope I get one at the end of this, right? Yes.
Do you acknowledge that there's a difference between the kind of test that certifies someone and the kind of test that we discuss in schools that is used as education?
Okay. Now, tests. Okay. Tests suck. They're completely useless. Well, you're using the wrong tests then, aren't you? You yourself have said that it is able. I'm sorry, but by your definition, you've just claimed that we are completely able to design a test that makes you be able and prove your skills. We're just giving it to the wrong people. Well, let's change that. We're not taking tests away. No, I'm sorry, you made a mistake. Sit down. Listen, what's happening is you've just conceded a big point. Now I'm being happy. Stop it. Basically, the problem is, for example, when we need to give people retraining, that the tests weren't testing for skills, and as our wonderful governments just told us, we're just giving these things to the wrong people. Now let's go on and have a look at, for example, the free market. Well, people don't always ask you and come and test you because they assume that you've been tested before. They assume that by the time you've entered that room, you probably know what you're doing and you actually have some business being there. And our testing throughout everywhere else has put you in the position to have a place, to have a purpose of sitting in that room right there.
Ma'am,
Yeah.
I think you've got a bit confused. The debate that we're having is about learning in schools. That's why Sam was saying that there's a big distinction between what you want to have in an education system and what you want to have in a professional system at the end. And do you not think that this debate shows, that even though we don't have judges, it's still a valuable experience for everyone involved? Otherwise, tutors just made us waste a whole hour of our time. We could have been doing something else. Have you learned something from this?
Well, I don't know, but considering I will be tested at the end, because, well, the audience will have a certain opinion at the end of this. Listen, it's a test. It is a test. You came, your first sentence in your own speech was testing sucks. By virtue of me looking around and everybody evaluating me right now as I speak, I'm being tested? No. Okay. So what we saw was that from the wonderful first opposition was that testing and the testing in the education system has led to changes in the education system, no thank you, that have proven beneficial in our society. Now what we went on to show you, that in society as a whole, we have a need for these tests in our education. We're not going to let you go away and say, yes, you've been very, very good. I'm sure you must have learned something because you have pretty eyes and a nice smile. And although you have pretty eyes and a nice smile, Sam, I wouldn't trust you for every single profession in the world. Go.
Oh, thank you. So, I like how you're focusing on eyes. My question is, you believe that a test is occurring when you look around. What part will you be looking at of the audience? Because you said that this debate is a form of a test for you. You'll be able to tell whether or not it was valuable by looking at your audience. You're against the eyes. Which part will you be
Okay, well, the
looking at?
second part of your question you were trying to force me on earlier was in schools. And considering I'm not in school right now, well, that's the other problem. Now, to get back to the main issue, the most important, how testing actually does benefit our society to the extent that we really need it. And we can't just say it all sucks. We can say that we need to change it. We can say that we need to get it to assess more relevant and better things at the right time, earlier when you're still in school learning what you're meant to be learning. But we can't just let it go. Because we need to assess who has the skills to do something. It's the critical distribution of the scarce. Come on, face it. We don't have limited money. We don't have limited place. We don't have unlimited money. We don't have unlimited seats in like universities. We need to give these to the people that will do the best out of this. We need to give this to the people who will give our society the most out of this. I'm sorry, but you're not doing this. So we have to also see all of this in a certain context. Just because you may have done something well, what happens if you didn't do it well enough? This is the whole framework that these tests, standardized or otherwise, put you in. You say, your number actually does mean something when I give it to you at the end of your test. We see which opportunities will be most beneficial to the people and how our society as a whole then gets the most benefit for what we have invested in you. All our skills need to be assessed. The government themselves conceded that we need to have a way of figuring out whether people are going to do something properly or not. And it's especially in the world that Tuna pictured, the world that changes so quickly around us, that we need to be able to know what we're most suited for. And what we're most suited for, how better are we going, where we can really maximise on our potential and maximise the potential of our society is where we need to be. And if it's standardised tests that prove that, and we believe they do, because we believe that they prove to you exactly where you are, how you can get there, and where you should be going, that it's best for the individual and it's best for the society. So vote up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. With this, we concluded this debate, and probably now, I'm going to have something to say. No.
You're quite good.
Oh, thank you. I thought you were much better.
I learned a lot.